In this tutorial, we're going to look at how to write a basic for loop. So to write a basic for loop, we start with the keyword for, and then inside the parentheses are going to be the three parts of the conditions for that for loop. The first part is where we create and initialize the variable that we're going to use to count through the loop. So you can technically declare the variable above the loop, but commonly we just declare it right inside. So we'll say, for example, while int I equals 1. So we've created a variable I that is the counter for that loop, and it's going to start with a value of 1. I end that piece of it with a semicolon, and that brings me to the next part. The second part is to put the condition of when we are going to stay in this for loop. So we're going to stay in the for loop as long as I is less than or equal to 5. So that is our condition for this for loop will execute as long as I is less than or equal to 5. So that's your Boolean condition that's going to get tested every time it goes back up and loops back to the top. And then the third part of writing a for loop definition is to determine how do we want I to change each time we go through the loop. So we're going to go with the really common one, I++. So I++ means that we're going to increment or go up by 1. And just like with any other if statement or loop, we want to start the statements with a curly bracket, and then we would end with a curly bracket. And again, just like with if statements or while loops, if there was only one statement inside the for loop, we technically don't need the curly brackets, but as a new programmer, I think it's good practice. So inside, we're just going to put a system.out.println I. We're just going to have it print I each time. And then after the loop ends, we're going to just put in a system.out.print. And we're just going to put done, just to indicate that we know that that loop is done. So notice that this line of code is outside of the for loop because the for loop ends right here with this curly bracket. So we're going to go ahead and run this so we can see what it looks like when it's running. And you can see that each time it's printing the counter I started at 1 per our definition. I went up by 1 each time, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and notice that per our definition, it stayed in as long as I was less than or equal to 5. So once I became 6, this loop no longer ran. So basically, when the loop runs and it gets to the end of the loop here, it's going to follow that condition of I going up by 1, and then it's going to swing back up to the top and test to see, is this true or not? So that's just how a common for loop works. Let's look at another one. If we say for int j, again, we can use anything. Typically with for loops, we commonly just use single letters just because it's faster. But let's say I want to say j equals, say, 10. We're going to go as long as j is greater than 0. And we're going to say j minus, or we're going to actually say j minus equals 2. So we got to kind of determine what that means. So now I have a counter that starts at, and I have a little misprint with my curly brackets here. So now we have a counter that starts at 10. It's going to go as long as it's greater than 0. And this time it's going to, instead of just being a basic go up by 1, or I could have said j minus minus to go down by 1, I'm going to go down by 2. So just to keep it simple, I'm just going to put a system.out.print in here. I'm not going to use a println this time. I'm going to have it print j plus a space so that I put a space in between each number there. And then after it, I'm going to put a blank system.out.println to make it so that it will go to the next line when I'm all done. So when we run this one, so we'll run again, our first one, we're going to see that we get our 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then done. And then for our second one, notice that it prints 10, 8, 6, 4, 2. So it's going down by 2 each time. The reason that it's not printing the 0 is because when J goes from 2 to 0 and it comes back up to check this condition, that's no longer greater than 0. So it skips out and it does not print that part. So that's just how to write a basic looking for loop. We can use for loops to do many other things. For example, we could do something as complex as finding out if a number is, how many numbers are, if a number is prime or not. And that's a really common problem that I sometimes like to give. But let's go ahead and do that in this example just to show you something a little bit more complex. So testing a value to see if it is prime. Okay, this is going to be a little bit more complicated. So let's say I have a number, we'll say int x equals 7, and I want to know, or 15, and I want to know if that number is prime or not. So in order to test to see if a number is prime, then I want to see if, I would need to check to see if it's divisible by anything between, 2 up to its value, right? Because prime numbers are only divisible by 1 in themselves. So I'm going to create a for loop that's going to start at 2. It's going to go up to x, which is the number that I'm trying to test, and it's going to go up by 1. And every time I run through this loop, I'm going to check to see if the counter k, if I can divide that into the number that I'm trying to test. So we're going to check to see if x mod k, right? Because if two things are divisible, then that means that when I divide them, the remainder would be equal to 0. So we're going to say if x mod k equals 0, then we know that the number is not prime, right? That it does work. If it were to run through the entire loop, which would end right here, and this statement never became true, then I know that the number would be prime. So there's a lot of different ways to do this. One way I like to do it is I like to create a Boolean, and I'll do that right inside, right here, yep, Boolean, and I'm going to call my Boolean prime, and I'm going to say let's assume that it is prime, so that that's true. So if this is the case, if it is divisible, then prime is now going to be equal to false. And so now what I'm doing is I'm checking every single number, and if at some point a number works, I can divide that number, 15 by that number. So for example, we know 3 is going to work, right? 3 goes into 15. This prime is going to become false. So when my loop is all done executing, now I can check and I can say if prime is still equal to true, then we want to print x is a prime number. Otherwise, we're going to print x is not a prime number. So again, this is something I really like to usually give as an assignment, is have you do this, but this is just an example. I showed you some really basic for loops so you can get the gist of how to write them, but you need to understand that when we utilize for loops, we're going to do a lot more than just basic printing of stuff. So when I run this, I'm going to expect to see that 15 is not a prime number if it works right? So 15 is not. So now let's test it by putting something that is prime, and let's put 11 in. And when I run through again with 11, we are going to see that when it prints out, it says 11 is a prime number. So this for loop is going through and checking every number starting at 2, up to but not including the number that I want to see if prime or not, and it's checking if it's divisible, if in any of those are, will divide evenly into it. So there's a quick brief overview of writing a for loop, and we'll see you next time.